Story 1. This all happened a few years ago, but even now, I still get an uneasy feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I feel comfortable sharing it now is because enough time has passed, and I do not think there is any risk in putting it out there. Back then, my wife and I had just moved out of the city and into the suburbs. We had just welcomed our third child, and with all the baby stuff, toys, and general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked and not think twice about it. The house itself was not huge, but it was definitely a big upgrade from the tiny space we had been living in before. One of the things that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had a beautiful but slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered throughout. The statues were weathered and had a bit of an eerie look, almost like something from a medieval fantasy show. My wife and I thought they gave the yard some character, although I personally did not care much either way. I figured leaving them in place meant less work for me, which was fine by me. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, admiring the yard, when something odd caught my attention. One of the statues, an angel, was facing away from the house. All the others were turned toward us, so it looked out of place. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction when we first moved in, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had just remembered wrong. The next morning, I looked out again and saw something that made my stomach drop. Another statue had turned around, now facing away from the house as well. This time, I knew for sure something was off. I asked my wife if she noticed anything strange, but she just shrugged and said she had not seen anything unusual. I even asked my son Jimmy, who was a bit of a prankster back then, but he gave me a look like I was crazy. I doubted he could have moved them anyway. I tried to let it go, convincing myself I had bigger things to worry about. Money was tight, and I was constantly stressed about keeping my job. A few days went by, and nothing strange happened, so I started to relax again. But then one evening, I looked outside, and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row, right at the edge of the house, just standing there. It was one of the most unnerving sights I had ever seen. I could not shake the feeling that those statues were watching me. I worked up the nerve to go outside and take a closer look. Before opening the back door, I scanned the yard to make sure no one was hiding out there. It was still daylight, but I felt paranoid. When I finally approached the statues, I tried to lift one and immediately realized something unsettling. These statues were incredibly heavy, too heavy for one person to move alone. I could not even budge one. While I was trying to make sense of it, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block, but that did not sit right with me. Everyone we had met seemed normal, and besides, who would pull a prank like that on a family with young kids? It felt more like harassment than a joke. We decided to call the police, but they could not do much. They suggested we install security cameras, but we could not afford them at the time. I told the officers we would consider it, but deep down, I hated the idea of turning my home into a fortress. After they left, my wife and I did our best to act normal for the kids, not wanting to scare them. The next few days were quiet, and I started to think the police had scared off whoever was responsible. Still, I felt uneasy every time I passed a window, half expecting to see something else out of place. I hoped the nightmare was over. Unfortunately, I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend morning. My kids were off school, and after breakfast, we went outside to play in the yard. That is when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my youngest child when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to keep them there. I do not know what came over me, but I stormed back outside, running through the garden and shouting threats at whoever had done it. Adrenaline was pumping, and I was looking for a fight, but there was no one there. As I walked back toward the house, my fear caught up with me. This was no joke. Someone was trying to intimidate us, and I had no idea how far they would go. The police came again and took another report, but they had no leads and nothing they could act on. They told me it might have been teenagers pulling a prank, but I did not buy it. They promised to have an officer patrol the area more often, but that did little to make us feel safer. That night, my wife and I were on edge. She was even more upset than I was, and I did my best to calm her down, even though I was scared out of my mind. Then, later that evening, she screamed from the living room. I ran in and found her pointing out the window. My heart sank. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, all wearing white masks. They were dancing in this weird, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there, frozen, watching them. It was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. Finally, I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we owned and yelled at my wife to call the police. Then, without thinking, I ran outside. I screamed at them and took a step toward them, but the moment I did, I regretted it. There were 5 of them, and only one of me. They could have been armed. Before I could do anything else, I turned and ran back inside. Thankfully, the knife must have scared them off because they ran into the garden and disappeared. The police showed up again, but the people were long gone. That was the last straw. The next day, I spent money we did not really have to install security cameras. My wife was on edge for weeks, begging me to move, but I promised her that if one more thing happened, we would leave. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick because we never saw those people again. Still, we stayed in that house, and to this day, we have never gotten any explanation for what happened. Story 2. My wife, Lisa, and I recently moved out of our old house. She never liked being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them. So, that is exactly what we did. We do not have kids, and she has not worked in years, so she was pretty open to my suggestions about where we should move. I am an electrician, so moving around for work is not a big deal for me. After looking at several places, we eventually settled on New Mexico. Both of us have always been rural folks, so it was not a huge adjustment. That was about 3 months ago, give or take. We found a great deal on a house way out in the country. Honestly, it is bigger than we need, especially since it is just the 2 of us and our black lab, Max, but we figured we could make use of the extra space. Maybe we would even host some of the new friends we hoped to make. We had been settled in for a few months when I first noticed something strange. The upstairs lights kept tripping the circuits, but the rest of the house still had power. After it happened once or twice, I knew what the problem was. Like I said, I am literally an electrician, so this kind of stuff is my bread and butter. I figured it would be a quick fix, probably just a matter of balancing the load on the breaker, which was most likely downstairs. I had not spent much time in the basement since we moved in. We looked at it briefly when the realtor showed us the place, but I did not pay much attention to it. Come to think of it, I do not think I had been down there even once since we moved in. Anyway, I walked down the stairs and started looking around for the main breaker. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and random junk. It looked more like a storage unit than a proper basement. After a bit of searching, I found the main breaker and started tinkering. About 10 minutes later, I figured out where the load imbalance was and decided I would rewire it when I had more time. I was about to head back upstairs when curiosity got the better of me. Since I was already down there, I figured I might as well have a look around. After all, this is my house, and it felt a little weird that I did not know every inch of it. Most of the basement was filled with junk and old furniture. Nothing seemed particularly interesting, and I quickly decided it would be too much trouble to try and clear it out to make it a usable space. That was when I saw something odd in the far corner. Behind a pile of old wooden chairs was a large metal door. It was not just any door either. It looked industrial, like something you would see in a bank vault or panic room. It was taller than most doors and looked heavy too. I walked over and gave the handle a try, but it would not budge. It was locked. My first thought was that it might be a tornado shelter or something like that, but you would think the realtor would have mentioned a feature like that. I immediately went upstairs and started digging through the drawer where we kept the keys the previous owners had left behind. I must have tried about 15 keys, but none of them worked. Eventually, I told Lisa about it, and she was just as curious as I was. Somehow, she managed to track down the previous owners and got them on the phone. That was when I stopped being curious and started getting concerned. They sounded strange on the phone, pausing like they were choosing their words carefully or trying not to say too much. Part of me wishes I had recorded that conversation. When I asked about the door, there was a long silence. Then the wife finally said it was a safe room in case of tornadoes. I told her that was fine, but we could not use it since it was locked. After another awkward pause, she said they lost the key and told us to just ignore it. That did not sit well with me at all. especially since they had left us keys to random doors we probably would never use. We ended the call quickly, and Lisa tried to laugh it off, but I could not let it go. Over the next few weeks, I kept wandering down there, staring at that door and wondering what was behind it. I tried every trick I knew to open it, but nothing worked. Eventually, I gave up, but curiosity got the better of me again. 2 days ago, I finally decided to hire a locksmith. The locksmith came over and spent about half an hour working on the door. When I checked on him, he told me the lock was unusually complex for a panic room. That made me even more curious, but he kept working and eventually cracked it. I wish he had not. Inside was a room that looked like some kind of shrine. The walls were covered in old black and white photos, all with strange symbols I did not recognize. In the center of the room was a single chair facing the wall. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time sitting there, staring at nothing. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and the whole place smelled stale and gross. Then I noticed the trash, empty chip bags and water bottles. That was when it hit me. Someone had been living down there, and not that long ago. Just when I thought it could not get worse, I noticed a second door in the corner. It was small and partially hidden. I opened it and saw stairs leading up to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like an idiot. I had never checked that door since we moved in. I had just assumed it led to the basement. Panic set in. Someone had been living in my house, and we had no idea. I tried calling the previous owners again, but they would not answer. Either they disconnected their number or just did not want to deal with it. That night, I barricaded the cellar door and padlocked it for good measure. We called the police, and they took a report. They said they would try to track down the previous owners, but warned it could take days. Later that night, we heard banging on the front door. Max started barking like crazy, and we froze. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. I grabbed a baseball bat and looked outside, but I could not see anything. Then we heard glass shatter downstairs. I ran down just in time to see 2 figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was broken. That was when I called the police again. They searched the property but did not find anyone. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there was angry about being locked out and came back to scare us. That was 2 days ago, and we still have not heard back from the previous owners. I am ready to defend myself if I have to, but I hope it does not come to that. Story 3. When I bought my first house, I was only 27 years old. I had saved up for years, and even though it was just a small and modest place, I was proud of it. Moving in, though, took some adjustment. I had lived with my parents my whole life, along with 3 siblings and 2 dogs. The house was always loud and full of life, but this was quiet, really quiet. That was honestly the hardest part about the transition, the lack of noise. Living alone felt strange, and at first, I was not sure I would ever get used to it. I'm sure anyone who has gone from living with family to living alone knows exactly what I'm talking about. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. Do not get the wrong impression. I do not even know if I can really call it a balcony. It was barely big enough to stand on, and I could not even fit a chair out there. Regardless, I would go out there most nights after work to take a break and clear my head. I smoked pretty often, but I hated the smell, so smoking inside was not an option for me. The balcony was twice as beneficial for that exact reason. I did not even have to go outside or leave the comfort of my own home just to smoke. It felt like a luxury. I will describe the layout of the property so what I am about to tell you makes sense. The block I lived on was pretty standard, with houses adjacent to each other all the way down the street. Behind mine was exactly the same, meaning everyone's house would be sharing a backyard if it were not for the 10-foot-tall fences marking the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over my backyard neighbor's fence and into his yard. You could see the whole place, really. After a few weeks, I realized I had met almost all the neighbors, except him. Come to think of it, I do not think I had ever seen him, let alone had a conversation with him. The guy never waved and never came over. I never saw him in the yard or at the bedroom window, nothing. It was like he did not exist. If it were not for the occasional bedroom light on at night, I would have assumed the place was deserted. I guessed that there was an older person living there since the grass looked like it had not been cut in years, and I never heard any sounds from their yard. After another week, Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go introduce myself and at least put a face to the name. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe make some small talk. But the house looked rough. Rough was an understatement. It looked completely untouched. The yard was a mess, overgrown with weeds, and the whole place looked like it had been ignored for years. The paint was chipping, some of the siding had been scratched off, and the walkway was stained. The doorbell was broken, so I gave a few loud knocks and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there and started to wonder if maybe the place really was vacant. But then I saw a slight movement behind the window shade, just a flicker, like someone was peeking out. That was enough for me. Someone was in there, spying on me, but would not open the door for some reason. I turned to leave when all of a sudden, the door flew open, slamming against the wall like someone had ripped it open in a violent rage. I jumped back, totally thrown off. I whipped around and found myself face to face with an elderly woman standing in the doorway, staring at me. She was short, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled but somehow tense, like she was flexing her face muscles, if that even makes sense. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I cannot even lie. I was pretty freaked out just looking at her. There was something off about her, like she looked like she was on something. She did not say a word, just stared with no expression on her face. Eventually, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla and gave me a half smile. And that was it. She did not even ask my name. She just stood there watching me. I nodded and turned away, not knowing what to say. I left feeling more unnerved than I wanted to admit. I never heard the door close behind me, but I did not want to turn around and get caught looking. Later that night, I went out to my balcony like usual, trying to forget about the strange interaction. At that point, I had no idea of the ordeal I had just gotten myself into. When I glanced over the railing, there she was, that crazy-looking lady from earlier, standing dead center in her yard, looking straight up at my house. She did not move, did not call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you wonder if you are actually seeing what you think you are seeing. I did not know if I should say something, wave, or pretend like I had not noticed her. It was one of the freakiest things I had ever seen, and I did not know how to handle it. I went back inside and told myself she was just a little messed up in the head and that I should not be getting worked up over a harmless old lady. But it did not stop there. The following night, I saw her again, but this time she was moving from one window to another inside her house, watching me from each one. Although I pretended not to notice her, part of me felt like she knew that I knew she was watching. I was hoping she would stop, but she did not. She was still looking at me when I finished smoking and turned to go inside. Out of curiosity, I peeked out one of my windows about 20 minutes later to see if she was still looking at my house. To my horror, she actually was. I called my dad, and he told me that she probably had dementia or something and that she was most likely just lonely or confused. He told me that I should actually feel bad for her. It was kind of hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me, but my dad calmed my nerves and assured me that she was harmless. A few nights passed without anything weird happening. I did not see her in her yard or at any of her windows. I thought maybe my dad had been right and was starting to feel glad that I had not done something drastic. That is, until one morning when I found a woman's sock on my side of the fence, just sitting in my yard. I stared at it, feeling a chill run through me. This was not just her strange behavior anymore. She had been on my property. I did not know what to do. I did not want to confront her, but I was starting to feel like I could not ignore it either. I should have called the police right there, but I did not because I did not want to create issues with a neighbor. That night, as I was lying in bed, the doorbell started ringing. Not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times, one right after the other. I did not even need to look. I knew it was her.